It's only May, but we already know for sure that 2020 will go down as the year of the corona pandemic. Some countries have been affected more than others, but all countries, without exception, have been affected enough for the virus to be a truly global phenomenon. We are at least several months away from a vaccine. Until that comes out, it is quite clear that the need of the hour is to contain the virus, to protect people from the virus, and keep the number of infections down to what health systems in various countries can handle. It is also clear what needs to be done to do that. People need to be tested for the virus, and people-to-people contact needs to be restricted to keep the virus from spreading. This basically means complete or partial lockdown of public spaces like schools, offices, markets, and theaters. Testing costs money, and lockdown has costs which people and governments have to bear. This means that in designing their corona strategies, governments have to strike a balance between the need to contain the virus and keeping economic losses down to what they can afford. Kenya is a lower middle income country which has been one of the most rapidly growing economies in Africa. It registered its first corona infection in late March. Since then, the number of known cases has grown to 672. 32 people have died. Kenya was quick to respond to the virus's outbreak. It placed restrictions on international travel and on movement between regions. A lockdown has been in place since March 15, which includes the nationwide evening curfew.
So what Kenya did was to identify hotspots, and it said that Nairobi is a hotspot, which is obvious because it has the big airport. Similarly, the Mombasa region is a hotspot because it has an airport and it has people coming in and out and tourists, etc. And then it kind of put a ring around these hotspots and said, let's limit movement in and out of these zones. And that's I think a good sort of first step. The next thing they would have considered is the kinds of activities where people are likely to violate social distancing. So gathering in restaurants, bars or clubs or any kind of recreation, right, is naturally a way in which social distancing norms would be violated. So the government said no to that. It said it should close those down. Funerals needed to be low key, only say, I think single digit number of people could attend. Similarly for weddings, it's asked that weddings should be put off if possible. Finally, let's say places like construction sites and supermarkets, I think they just gave out a lot of advisories about how people should conduct themselves within these spaces. Obviously, those still remain vulnerable. I walk into a supermarket, I see 50 odd people. It's physically impossible, I think, to make sure that nobody's touching anything. But there are advisories in place, and then I think supermarkets have taken to sort of measures where people are sanitizing before they enter. It's being insisted that you have to have a mask if you walk into a supermarket. In fact, you have to have a mask if you're walking on the road right now.
These measures have probably helped keep the number of infections and deaths down to what they are. At the same time, livelihoods of individuals and the economy as a whole have taken a hit.
Obviously, developing countries which need to grow at 5, 6, 7, 8% per annum if they want to meet their poverty alleviation goals, for them, even a 1% growth or a stagnation, let alone a contraction, can be disastrous. So in Kenya, the early estimates were 5% contraction of GDP if the worst case scenarios of the spread of the disease were realized, or if the lockdowns continue for a long time. The economic impact is not static, right? It'll depend on how long this kind of situation stays where Kenya is forced to remain under a partial economic lockdown, how long the global sort of travel restrictions continue. Tourism doesn't pick up for 2 years. Countries like Kenya, where tourism makes up a significant portion of its revenues, is going to be badly hit. So the economic impact, I think, we are yet to know, and it'll be a rolling estimate.
Most countries have had to implement similar measures and endure the economic impacts. But compared to richer nations like those in Western Europe and North America, these economic impacts are a bigger blow to developing countries like Kenya.
Makes perfect sense in Western Europe, where if you put people under lockdown and they're not running out of food, there's no food shortage immediately, right? Or there's no, they have some kind of income security. You just have to keep them from mixing and you probably protect lives. In Kenya, it's in that chain, the causality doesn't work as automatically. A lot of people earn their livelihood from daily work. So they have to work in order to earn a living. Maybe you can afford to do it for 2 weeks. You ask them to do it for 2 months. Eventually you'll have problems of nutrition. You'll have, malnutrition is an issue. There are other issues like just the just the loss of income and then the ability to keep yourself, to sustain yourself. Same situation in India, same situation in Bangladesh. You tell people not to work, not to earn a living. It's not guaranteed that just by enforcing social distancing, you can save lives. But it is guaranteed that by that you will destroy the livelihood. And will those people be able to recover that piece of livelihood, that mode of livelihood later, is a big uncertain question. And the second reason is that the public finances of the governments in these countries simply don't allow the government to extend a safety net that would compensate for 100% loss in livelihood. So it may be able to compensate for some degree of loss of livelihood. It may be able to compensate for 100% of loss of livelihood for a limited period of time. But beyond that, it is simply impossible for the government, even through the existing cash transfer mechanisms, to compensate for a complete loss of livelihood. You could enforce some kind of lockdown or shutdown that limits livelihood opportunities for some time. Use that time to prepare your countries, get sort of new norms or physical distancing norms impossible, social distancing norms in effect, and then unlock sectors of the economy so that certain key livelihoods can keep going.
In the short term, millions of people who are the hardest hit by loss in income and livelihoods need immediate assistance. These include the chronically poor and people with disabilities. These people are already covered by Kenya's social safety net systems. These systems need to be utilized now to provide emergency cash transfers.
So in Kenya, there are, I'd say, about a million families, which is, let's say, about 5 million people, which is over 10% of the population of the country, that already benefit from one form of social safety net endowment or the other. So they're covered by a government system, mostly government. I think there are some private experiments or private programs as well. Non-profit NGO programs as well. But let's say give or take, it's about 1 million families, 5 million people, 5 or 6 million people who are covered, get certain sums of money. Now, if donors want to help Kenya, they should try and channelize more cash transfers through these mechanisms. And I think one needs to look at the data to see the coverage. I suspect that most of the people covered by the social safety nets currently are in rural areas. One probably needs to bring in the urban poor as well into that net, and then see what you can channel.
At the end of the day, no matter how smartly Kenya manages the corona crisis, it will need to meet expenses that it had not budgeted for. Like many other developing countries, it does not have a huge budget surplus it can dig into, and its ability to raise money is limited.
The stimulus that countries can afford, and the stimulus for which the countries think they would have to borrow additional money, is going to be limited by the economic situation in those countries. Right now, countries like Kenya already run a pretty significant fiscal deficit on their budget. So the amount that they can actually borrow from the market is quite limited, and frankly, it may be really not able to afford that kind of borrowing from the market. That's why one is looking at, let's say, the IMF for soft loans, and the IMF has said that it has about $1 trillion available for this kind of lending. And in an interview, Geeta Gopinath, chief economist, right, was saying that over 100 countries have already approached the IMF asking for different kinds of assistance, different modes of assistance. Now, $1 trillion is actually not that much, right? I mean, if you consider the global GDP, the $1 trillion is a very small portion of that. And consider that now being divided across 100 countries, according to need, let's say, and India has not even approached the IMF, so it wouldn't. I think the general conclusion is that there is just not enough aid money that can go in. Compounded, of course, by the fact that this is one situation where, unlike, let's say, Ebola in the recent past, I mean, the developed world is dealing with deaths on their own soil, right? So this is not, the right time for those governments to even summon up the kind of resources to help, let's say, Africa or, the new bottom billion, right? At this point of time, it's simply not the right time. So one has to accept that the quantum of aid is just going to be limited. And while it might plug some gaps, it is not going to be anywhere enough.
So what can developing countries do to dampen the fiscal hits they are bound to take from the corona crisis?
Countries that have announced budgets in the last 6 months probably, I think, or quite certainly need to present a revised budget in the next 3 to 4 months. I mean, they need to re-budget. So, for instance, if Kenya thinks that its tax revenues are going to fall by 30%, I mean, obviously its public expenditure outlay will have to reduce at least by 30%, plus the new money that it is able to attract through borrowings and aid. But there will be a shortfall, right? So unless we re-budget and say what is the amount of public investment that is now possible, in terms of an immediate recovery that countries are trying to do from within their budgets, what amount of spending can you front load? So payments that would have been made in sort of regular intervals over the course of the year to immediate relief. Now, one has to have dialogues with the private sector to figure out all the money, let's say, that they are not spending right now. Investments have slowed, right? So the capital that they are not spending, the advertising budgets that they are not spending, the production that they are not, the supply chains that are not running, the factories that are not running, which, obviously have costs, but also saving working capital. What are the conditions that private sector needs in order to accelerate the investment cycle or the spending cycle as soon as the lockdown is lifted?
The last and most important ingredient of economic recovery is change and reform. The crisis presents an opportunity and demands that governments reform how public sector programs are implemented and that they pick and back winners of the future from the private sector.
So in Kenya, for instance, supermarkets have continued, right? So which is, I think, is important. All kinds of home delivery of everything, starting from food to supermarkets or groceries, all that continues, which I think is really important. And a lot of internet based sales and marketing have continued, which is great. And that shows, in a sense, that you're also testing out the resilience of different kinds of livelihood options within the country. And I think it'll teach the government some important lessons, right? For what kind of livelihoods are more resilient than others. So the global lockdown might end in a matter of 6 months. Some kind of activity might resume. But increasingly, analysts are again saying, or experts are again saying, that the nature of recovery is likely to be quite slow. So it's important that countries like Kenya, other countries in the same similar situation, try and think of a long-term economic recovery program. You will realize the impacts of that, or the negative impacts of that, maybe 2 years down the line, when you notice that there are a far more number of people who slip back into poverty as a result of this massive shock that they've experienced. So plan a long-term recovery program. Use this as an opportunity to bring in some much-needed reform to the way government schemes or government welfare programs are run. Even public works and infrastructure programs are run in the country, so that you put in place systems that can be used when more money starts being channeled through either bilateral or multilateral mechanisms.